Oh, now I've got two engineers. What a deal. Welcome to Lighthouse Living Room, and I'm your host for the next few minutes. And we are going to be speaking or talking about a guy named Peter. And last week we talked about failures, never final. And sometimes we make boasts that we cannot, if you will, follow through with. And especially in his case, that's exactly what happened to that poor guy. He got himself caught. But something was said this last week. I was reading through some material, and something came to my purview that I thought was very interesting. We talk about triggers, and tonight we're going to be talking about the God of second chances. Triggers. And triggers in people's lives and what it takes to get you to kind of go off, if you will. I know that a lot of people have those triggers. Certain things really irk them. Certain things bring back memories all of a sudden, clearly as quickly as they may have gone or just dissipated. Something will come into your life, or smell, or a place that you've gone, or one of those deja vu moments. And of course, none of us have those, right? That's all. No, it happens. Anyway, to make a long story short, as I was reading through, and Jesus speaking to Peter, and we'll talk about it in just a moment, he was talking to Peter about the fact that, that he was making this big boast, and he was saying this, and I said, I'm not gonna let you down. I won't run. I won't do this. Well, Jesus calmly turned around to him and he said, "Hey, bud, before the rooster crows 3 times, man, says you'll deny me 3 times." Now, I thought that was really interesting. That was, to me, was a trigger. But the thing that I thought was more interesting is what this particular author said. It said this. It said that every time after he had failed, listen carefully what I'm about to say. Every time he failed after this, that he heard a rooster crow, do you think it was a trigger? Think about it. I'm the guy that said, no, I don't know who this guy is. I mean, he even went into some of the translations even make a mention to this, that the fact that Peter actually swore, okay, let's just put it this way. Christians never do that. Just saying. I don't know how hard you have to hit your thumb, but I'm just saying. There's something, the Rabbi was just showing me his thumb. Yeah. And so I'm just saying that there are triggers in our lives that remind us of things that we have done, maybe good or maybe bad. The trouble is that what we do with the trigger, there's a reason for the trigger, and I want to elaborate on that a little bit when we get to there, simply because of the fact that I don't believe that many of us, you know how you go, I'll use this as an example. It's probably a poor example, but I'll use it anyway. How many times we come to a service and we're in a deliverance service and we walk down to the front to have the man of God or the woman of God lay hands or 3 or 4 people pray over you to be delivered of something, whatever the case may be. The problem is, here's the problem, is that trigger happens 4 or 5 weeks down the road, or 6 weeks down the road, or a month down the road, and all of a sudden you're back to exactly where you were before you walked down that aisle and had somebody lay hands on you. And I want to tell you something. There is something significant about triggers that a lot of people don't understand. Sometimes we need to maybe fall back into the James theology, where he says, count it all joy when you have all kinds of trials hit your life or things that happen in your life. But we don't understand that concept because in the Christian community, we don't talk about anything that's real or anything that really happens. We want to talk about roses, and we want to talk about lilies, and we want to talk about flowers in the valley, and everything's cool. But then we got to go to Psalms 23, where we see, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will, what? Fear no evil. So the trigger is, what are you allowing in your life to create an atmosphere where the enemy can actually punch your button? We're going to talk about that tonight, and I think it's actually quite interesting that a lot of people will never admit to, or will never allow themselves to be caught up in that whole scenario, if you will. Follow with me now. Let's take a look at the things. We're going to look at Peter's life in a couple of different ways. We're going to look first at chapter 22 of Luke, verses 24 through 34. Chapter 22 of Luke. We read this last week, but we're going to talk about it some more because I have some questions that go along with this chapter that I want to, this reading, that I want you to look at. And why do I want you to look at it? Is to remind you of who Peter really is. Now, here we are in 22 verses 24 through 34. This is a really interesting and, to be honest with you, a really crazy thing that Jesus comes back with. And I say crazy because it didn't make any sense to me. Only in a first century theology would you be able to get this. Now, I know that this sounds weird, and maybe it sounds a little bit different, but sometimes we need to understand, and I've said this probably dozens and dozens of times, the Bible was not written to us, it was written for us. It was written to a different generation, to a different group of people. But the Bible still applies to us today. Why? Because if we put on our hat of first century theology and understanding, all of a sudden things make sense. So here we go. Not a lot of long read, but here it is. Now there was also a dispute among them as to which of them should be considered the greatest. Now, some people say Peter started it. I'm just saying. And sometimes I kind of believe them because Peter seems to always be the first guy out, last guy in. Anyway, and he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those who exercise authority over them are called benefactors. But not so among you. On the contrary, he who is greatest among you, let him be the younger, and he who governs as he who serves. For who is greater, he who sits at the table or he who serves? Is it not he who sits at the table? Yet I am among you as the one who serves. But you are those who have continued with me in my trials. This is a very interesting term. He uses trials. And I bestow upon you a kingdom, just as my Father bestowed one upon me, that you may eat and drink of my table in my kingdom, and sit on the thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Now here he goes on, and this is where everybody gets real disturbed. And the Lord said, Simon, Simon, indeed, Satan has asked for you, that he may sift you as wheat. We talked about this great deal last week. What's it look like to be sifted as wheat? What does it look like? How you get beat and how you get thrown in the air so that the kernels will come off, and then you throw the chaff to the wind and let it blow it out of the area that you're chafing and trying to get all of this done, and then you sweep up the kernels and you put them, and then you still have to do it in a basket up and down and get all of the chafing out of it so that you're not eating the part that is no good. It's fascinating to me. Satan has asked to sift you like wheat. How many of you have been in a position like that? Think about that. But now I have prayed for you that your faith should not fail, and when you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren. That's a key verse. Verse 32 is a key verse. But I have prayed for you that your faith should not fail, and when you have returned to me, that's key. Return to me. What do you think that means? But he said to him, Lord, I am ready to go with you, both to prison and to death. Dun, dun, dun. Drop the mic. No, 34, then he says, I tell you, Peter, the rooster shall not crow this day before you will deny me 3 times that you know me. Ooh, boy, that's a rough one. I just said I was going to die for you. I was going to go to prison for you. Man, I'm your best buddy. Oops, didn't work. Apparently didn't get his attention. But what I'm saying is this. So all of these things that are going on, but the first thing that he says in this little excerpt that we were just talking about, and let's take a look at his response to the quarrel. Become a servant. You're not going to become kings before you become a servant. In other words, before you can ever become in authority or in charge, you must serve. In response to his quarrel, he says, kings like to throw their weight around, and people in authority like to give themselves fancy titles. Boy, isn't that a fact. Keep their ratios in check. Get a lot of likes when you're on social media. It's like the two people that were in D.C. today, Adam Schiff and Falwell, crying and whining and moaning because they got kicked off the Intel Committee. Well, I wonder why the heck they did. Because they lied to the American public. What am I saying here? Exactly the point. Jesus is saying the same thing. Dude, before you can be in charge, you need to know how to serve. Figure that out. This is not hard. It's not rocket science. Then he goes on to tell them that the senior among them should become the junior, and the leader should take the part of the servant. This is golden, man. This is stuff that you just don't hear this all the time, that we need to understand. In Jesus' case, he's saying, before you can basically judge the nations, or even the tribes, as he talks about, before you can do that, learn to serve. Isn't it funny how people that come or move from one church to another, or sometimes they come in and they tell you about all their accolades? It cracks me up. It just really does. First thing comes out of their mouth, I did, oh, but you know what? I don't want to hear that. What I'm looking for, I'll tell you what I want to hear. What can I do to help the family of God here in this place? Oh, man, you got me one over. Buddy, you're my best bud. Why? Because that is a different attitude than the one that I normally see come through the front doors. And that's one of the things that I see happening in the church today. A lot of people like the idea of the social media platform so that they can throw stuff out there and get a like, and get somebody to like them, get somebody else to say, oh, isn't that lovely? And the trouble is that the world that they're projecting to the world, their world that they're projecting to the world is fake, because it's not real. I'm sorry. There's trials in life. You're going to go through some stuff. It may not be right now, but it's going to be down the road. But the one thing that God will do, he said, if you learn to be a servant, you'll not only weather it, you'll win the day. Win the day. That's the whole difference. I'm speaking to the choir. I'm just saying. It's a big deal. Here's another one. Now, real authority in Jesus' eyes is developing a role of a servant in a leader-obsessed world. And boy, I mean, it is every bit of that, don't you think? The other thing that was interesting, he said, stay on your toes. What do I mean by that? What Jesus takes his time to warn Simon Peter, and you notice that he called him Simon Peter, not Peter. Simon Peter. In other words, look where you've come from, Simon Peter. He called him Cephas. What does Cephas mean? In some translations, it means a pebble. And everybody's turned it into, in Peter's case, a rock. Well, he ain't that rock yet. I'm just saying, probably more like a pebble. But you know what the funny thing about pebbles are? Those are the things you trip on. If you're a big rock, you move around it. If it's a bigger stone, foot or so, 6 inches or so, you're not going to step on it because you know you're going to hurt yourself. But what do? We trip over the little ones that are everywhere. I mean, especially after all this rain. My goodness, I've never seen so much stuff in the street. And it's everywhere. Little things. He says, Jesus takes time to warn Simon Peter that Satan has his eye on him. In other words, dude, watch yourself. Satan's coming after you. Trial is about to come. But don't you love what he said in that little bit that we just read? He said, but I've prayed for you. I've prayed for you. But he says something very interesting, and I don't think we get it or put two and two together. Watch. He says, Simon Peter, He says, remember where you came from. You're the rock. I know who you are. I know where you're going to be. But this is where you started. Remember the difference. In between somewhere. All of us are the same. Mark, I know how it is. But Mark, this is what's going on. Now, here's the interesting part. He says, Satan wants to sift you like wheat, but I've prayed for you. And then the next line, he says something fantastic. He said, I know you're going to fall flat on your face. But he says, when you recovered from that, in other words, when you gain your faith back, support your brethren. Love your brothers. Do what it takes to get them and make them successful. Isn't that interesting? That he's already predicting a comeback. He's already predicting a failure, but he is seeing the finished product. This is why it's so important for each of us to understand the finished product is what Jesus is interested in you. Every single time you fall flat on your face, Jesus is already preparing a comeback tour. What does that mean? In other words, you're going to have to get up. You're going to have to, you might have some bruises. I just love that one progressive commercial where the one guy that's such a loudmouth that he races to knock a ball down that is coming after a car. Because he's the insurance guru. He's going to save the day. And so he knocks this thing down. The next scene, you see Flo with the mercurochrome, or actually probably iodine, putting it on his knee, and what does he do? He falls backwards in a complete rage, and they're going, this hurts. Well, your comeback is coming. This is what it's all about. We are not immune to those things that happen in life. Don't let anything keep you down. Remember that failure is never final. Failure is the begin of understanding. Sometimes we have to fail to be able to achieve. Think about that for a moment. Oh, man, now I'm preaching. This is a good part. What we need to understand, Peter was having a challenge here. What does he say? Oh, man, don't worry about me. I'll go to prison for you. Oh, don't worry about me. I'm going to pull the sword, man. I'm going to take care of business. I'm going to make sure everything's good. Well, we'll find out in a moment. That was probably not a good move on his part. Just saying. Here it is. Now, here's some other things that we need to understand. This placement in the book of Luke, without any additional words from Peter, caused me to interpret that maybe Peter started the whole debate about who's the greatest. We know who Muhammad Ali is probably one of the greatest boxers ever. And what did he say? I'm the greatest. I remember him talking and taunting everybody. I am the greatest. Well, he won the greatest at the end. But the fact is, at the time, he was. But the thing is that we need to understand who we are in him, not in ourselves. If you get out of yourself and get into him, you'll find out how this really works. Now, don't waste your time focusing on followers or to get the most likes. That's when the devil will absolutely sneak in and pull the rug out from underneath you. Because when you think you're doing good, he is going to hammer you. That's why you have to be careful. Make sure that what you do is followed by doing it. Don't talk, just do. That's a servant's mind. We can talk about doing things, but the fact is the servant's the one that does it. Go polish my rims on my car. Okay, yes, sir. You just go do it. Go do this. Just do it. Jesus says, go do this. Just do it. It isn't up to you. Remember that. You're a servant. And to be able to be a judge over nations, you need to learn that attitude. Larry's probably watching tonight, and I just love Larry, because every time I come on Sunday or during the week and I see after he's gone through the bathrooms, every one of the toilets are in attention. The top is straight up. How do I know that? Because Larry's been here. I think it's very cool. I'm just saying. I know that sounds silly on my part, but that means someone paid attention to the toilet I'm about to use. I don't know about you. That makes me feel good. So, thank you, Larry. Anyway, so here's the next one. How about this one? Give others a fresh start. Give others a fresh start. What does that mean? This is a fun one. What Jesus says to Peter after he assures him that a trial will happen, he's telling him, it's coming. It's coming. And all of us need to understand the same thing. Always, life is not perfect. The trouble is, we dwell on the negative instead of on the positive. What does it mean? A couple of people come to mind when I think about positive. Jo Beth's one of them. She's watching tonight. I think she's just an amazing lady, that everything is positive. Everything she has, she just refers back to as positive. To me, that's very important. And that is a maturing or a thought process that comes into mind. And you know what? For me, pumping her up, it's okay because I can. That's one of the things that I think is really, really interesting about individuals. You can tell. Some people you go and everything's, you feel like it's Eeyore on the top of the bridge looking down at the water when they say, oh, isn't the water look beautiful? He goes, oh, but it's so cold. Yeah. I get it. Just saying, there are people that you and I and everyone will have to not put up with, pray for, because they're always on the side of the negative scale. That's one of the things. But here's Jesus is trying to tell him something. Hey, a trial's coming, dude. Just get it in your head. Satan wants you really bad. He really does. But I've prayed for you. But when you fall, get up, dust yourself off, and help your brothers. Now, here's the thought. This message is for all of us. When trials happen, because it's not a matter of, it's a matter of when, not if. They will happen. Stuff will happen. And if you let them scrape you, push you, refine you, rebuild you, and then turn back around to your brothers and sisters and love on them and say, hey, man, not a good idea to go there. I've been there. Don't recommend it. Just saying. You know, the thing that kills me about some people is that they will go, and when they're looking for something in Amazon, they'll spend an hour reading the reviews. And you know, people that you got to remember something about reviews. I'm just telling you, just got to remember, most people who put a review in don't like the product. And if they say they do like the product, and it's a long one, it's because they figured it out the first time. I don't know about you, but it's kind of like the bicycle that you're going to give the kid at Christmas, and guys throw away the instructions and can't figure out how to get the front fender on, that you have to take the whole frickin' thing apart to put the thing on there. Believe me, I've been there. This is what I'm saying. We need to understand that trials will come. How you deal with them depends greatly on how you see yourself in the outcome. Now, we can fail, and we can do the get in the bed and do the fetal position thing in the back and under the covers and be cool, but that's not how it works. Jesus is trying to tell Peter, we got a problem coming. Just right here. How about this? He says, turn back around and do that. Now, we don't go through trials just so we learn something for ourselves. We go through trials so that we will learn something to share and have wisdom for others don't have to cross that bridge. Okay? One of the things that we don't understand about that is that sometimes sharing a testimony of something dumb creates an atmosphere so someone else doesn't do the same thing. Are you with me? All right. So now, we go through trials so we can turn back and encourage others. Now, here's some things that maybe you should think about. What are the trials that have happened to you this year? Or maybe just recently? What have you learned from it? Whatever you're doing with it. Are you changing course? Are you trying to change how you do things? Now, I think it's important because one of the things that I find interesting about trials is that trials tend to shape character. And if you're not careful, it will shape your character in the wrong direction, or it will shape your character in the right direction. The right direction of character building is knowing something that you should never try to do before. I did this as a young man, and it was really dumb. And I was sharing this with Ernie that I had a car that I had bought that I shouldn't have bought, and believe me, I just didn't go buy it. Wife and I both talked about it, but it was a pretty sizable car payment, and we had just built a new home. It's the second one here in the valley that I was in, and so I put an ad in the paper, and I said, "Hey, why don't you come?" I said, I want someone to come over and take over. It was a lease. I said, I want you to take over the lease, and I said I'd be willing to do it for I can't remember, like $300. It was some ridiculous amount. And it was a brand new car. I mean, it was like brand new car. Why did I need a brand new car? Don't know. I'm just saying. I said, so this guy came, and he came, and he said, "Oh, I'd love to have this car." "Oh, okay, yeah." And so I had him sign an agreement. I talked to a friend of mine who's an attorney, and I said, so I made an agreement up, and he signed it, and I signed it, and I kept a copy of it, and off he went with my car. Well, lo and behold, he didn't pay one payment. He didn't pay anything. In fact, in 6-7 months, I got a phone call from the bank wanting to know where the payments were, and well, there wasn't any. When I tried to get a hold of the guy, he had moved. And not only had he moved, he moved a long ways away. He moved out of Ventura, and he went all the way down to Los Angeles. Well, I knew one thing that he did. I knew that he worked at a hospital. I knew another thing, that he was also something else. And so I got a friend of mine to find him. And so I just told the leasing company, I'm not going to pay anything anymore. This is the address where the car is. Please repo it. So he did. So they did. And come to find out that he took my red car and turned it into a brown car, painted it, because he never intended to pay me a dime or pay anything on it. He was just going to drive it until it ran into the ground. But what I'm trying to tell you is that, you know what? I've never done anything like that before. Never done, and I've never done it again. Why? Because it hurt me, destroyed my credit, and just all kinds of things went south. But here's my point that I'm trying to say. Learn from your mistakes. Don't do them again. Change direction, change thought, change understanding. It's so much better if you just listen to what the Lord says. One of the things that I have now, that's one of my big deals, one of my biggest deals when I talk to anybody about finances, I said, don't buy anything on a whim. Spend 24 hours thinking about it, and the next day you might find out that you don't need whatever it is. Just saying. That's my free advice for those of you, because I don't want you to go through what I went through. Just saying. Now, how about this one? So let's recap what we were just talking about, because we're going to take a look at some more scripture, which I think is really interesting. Now, Jesus calls Simon to be his disciple and gives him a new name, Peter, which means pebble or rock, whichever way you want to interpret that. Jesus makes a bold claim over Peter's life. A lot of people believe this. Last week I explained to you when he was outside of Caesarea Philippi, and he was talking to Peter and his group there, and he said, upon this rock I will build my church. Well, he was talking about the gates of hell, and he was talking about the temple in Pan, the worship of Pan, where they were standing, and he was talking about that. But he was also talking about Peter as a rock. And what did he mean by that, and what was he talking about? I do believe that he was telling him that it will be because of you that a lot of things will change in the first century church after his resurrection. Very important, because we're going to see something here that I think is very interesting. Now, Peter experiences many miracles, while Jesus and Peter tend to be one who is outspoken. Peter's outspoken. We know that. Oh, yeah, believe me. He's absolutely certain that he will not deny Jesus. Trial, it doesn't matter what comes. He says, I'm going to handle it. So let's take a look at Luke 22 and 47 through 62. Now, this is where it really gets interesting. 47, and this is the betrayal, if you will, and all the way to 62. Now, why is this important? Because what Jesus told him comes true. Here it is. And while he was still speaking, behold, a multitude, and he who was called Judas, we know who he is, bad guy, one of the 12, went before them and drew near to Jesus and kissed him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? You know, the funny thing is, you can't hide anything from him. These guys were so totally out to lunch. They're totally out to lunch. There was nothing you could do that he didn't know what was going on. And when those around him saw what was going to happen, this is key, follow with me now. He said to him, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. You know who that was? Guess who? The guy that wouldn't deny him, Mr. Peter. Mr. Cephas, rock, yanks out a sword. And the funny thing is, if you read back a little bit, they only had 2 swords. So he was carrying one of them, and somebody else was carrying one. But here's the deal. He pulled it before anybody told him to do anything and whacked off this dude's ear. Now, I want you to catch this whole thing. You've got to remember what's going on. Let's set the scene so you see what it looks like. There's a whole group of soldiers. There's a whole group of high priest individuals. They're all there to take Jesus into custody. Now, what's interesting about this is that they're coming fully loaded. In other words, they've all got swords and shields and the whole 9 yards, right? And so Peter decides it's really be cool, just go ahead and whack off this dude's ear. And Jesus says, knock it off. He said, you weren't asked to do this. But look what happens in the midst of this. This is what blows my mind. In the midst of this, Jesus goes to the high priest's helper, or whoever he was, and picks his ear up off the ground. I mean, think about this. And then he says, will you permit me to do this? Well, I don't know about you. I've got blood running down my neck and down my shoulder, and I've got my hand over my ear, and I'm freaking out because I just saw a blade go by and whack off my ear. I don't know about you, but that would freak me out. And now you have Jesus doing what? I've got his ear. Jesus has got his ear, and he says, would you permit me to do this? Everyone there is watching. They could have said, no, you're under arrest, dude. No. He puts the ear back on and heals him right in front of everybody. I don't know about you. These are the same soldiers that are going to drag him to the high priest and drag him in to see Pilate. Think about this. These guys just saw a miracle right there in front of their eyes, and they're freaking out. Everybody's panicked. Chaos is happening. And who's in the middle? Peter. Oh, my. Here we go. Follow me now. Well, it even gets more fun. And Jesus answered and said, permit even this. And he touched his ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and captains of the temple and the elders who had come with him, have you come out against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you daily in the temple, you didn't try to seize me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness. Ooh, that's a powerful word. And the power of darkness. Having arrested him, they led him and brought him to the high priest's house, but Peter followed at a distance. Now, when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them. And a certain servant girl, seeing him, had he sat by the fire, looked intently at him and said, This man was also with him. But he denied him, saying, Woman, I don't know him. And after a little while, another saw him and said, You are one of them. But Peter said, Man, I'm not. Then after about an hour passed, another confidently affirmed, saying, Surely this fellow also was with him, for he's a Galilean. And that's horrible. Ew, you're Galilean. It's kind of like when they talk about us here at Oakview. Oh, he's from Oakview. Yeah, believe me, Ventura and Oakview, we used to have baseball teams that we would play against each other to see who would win. That'd have superiority. Wow, big deal. But Peter says, Man, I don't know you, what you're saying. Immediately while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Ooh, can you imagine? Can you imagine? Looked at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word of the Lord and how he had said to him, Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. So Peter went out and wept bitterly. You know, when you fall, sometimes you fall pretty hard. In this case, he fell really hard. So in this account, it's very interesting to me that what happens here is so interesting, especially the part where he heals the priest's helper. I just think it's amazing because what we see is something different than what we were expecting. They were expecting to come grab him. There's going to be a big scuffle, a big chaos. Instead, nothing happened. And the thing that was even more interesting, there's another place in the Gospels where it talks about this, which just floors me. This is really hard. This is a hard one to grasp and a hard one to get in your mind, especially when you're dealing with the situation with Jesus. When they ask, "Are you Jesus?" and he says, "I am he," they all fell on their face. Not backwards, forward. Think about that for a minute. Like somebody pushed them down. Boom. What was happening? Do you get a sense of what was going on? He's Lord of Lords, King of Kings. He's the guy. Boom, on the ground. When they were getting themselves up, everyone in that company fell face first on the ground. I don't know about you. That is a huge thing. Darkness just got kicked in the pants. Think about it. Something really weird happened there. Now, I know we're all caught up. So what does Jesus do in response to all this? He heals the guy and then says, "Yeah, I'm the guy." What are you going to do? And they arrest him. What do they arrest him? Put his hands behind his back, just like we see Perp walking, the whole deal, take him up to the priest's house. That, to me, is really telling, is because this is what they wanted all along. But they did not realize what they were going to get. They just didn't. Now, if you read the same account in John 18, you'll notice that it's Peter who draws a sword and cuts off the soldier's ear. You've got this one disciple saying, "Lord, should we draw the sword?" It wasn't him. The other guy held it. He goes, "Lord, what do I do?" "Leave it in there." He says, "Don't be doing that." And you notice that they didn't get the swords confiscated. They don't say anything about taking them away. They just said, "Are you Jesus?" And then they let him away after they all hit the deck and everything else is going on. I don't know about you, but that scene had to be pretty amazing. I'm just saying. I'm a nobody, so here we are. So when we first read this account and realize that Peter took matters into his own hands, I felt God saying, see, how easy is it for us to take things into our own hands when you're afraid God's not handling it? Think about it. This is a plan. God had a plan, and he was doing what he was going to do, and they should listen to what Jesus was saying. But what they were doing is they were doing their own thing, Peter in particular. And in doing that, he failed miserably in two things. One, the immediacy of what was going on. Second, when he was being asked, "You're one of those guys." If Peter was going to be the Peter that we know and love so well and love so much, he should have said, "Yeah, it's me. What about it?" And stood up to him like only Peter would do, "Hey, get out of my face." No, he didn't do that. "No, I don't know him. No, I don't know him." How many times we do stuff sometimes on the spur, thinking that we're doing God's will, and what we're really doing is getting in the way? Think about it. Sometimes we fail in getting in the way. It's just how it works. But remember, God is a God of second chances. Always second chances. You fail, he gives you a way. He shows you how to become. He takes you through it so that you can be a victor in what you do. Follow me now. This is pretty amazing. How many times do I impulsively do something without stopping to ask myself some essential questions? It's like, is God asking me to do this? Or am I doing this just because I'm doing this? I'm just saying. God can handle this on his own? Does he really need my help? And sometimes we just go ahead and do it anyway. How come it is that we create so much chaos? Just saying. have we been mindful to take this story into our own hands when chaos is spreading like wildfire all around us? Sometimes we do that. Sometimes entering into a quarrel with someone because you think you know the answer may not be a good idea. Just saying. Now, I think today that we find little ways to deny Jesus in a lot of things that we do. When we pick our strength over His, when we settle for our plans instead of waiting on His, when we pull the sword out of fear and just start hacking away at people's ears. That's kind of an interesting analogy if you think about it. Now, we consider saying, I know you're the most important thing in my life, but I choose my way instead. That's sometimes how it goes. So place yourself in Peter's shoes. What can you imagine he's experiencing after you hear the rooster crow? What are some of the emotions he probably felt? I don't know about you, but when you fail in a situation, get caught in a lie, or get put in a position where you're embarrassed, it's pretty nasty. We're talking about somebody's life here. Jesus was going to the cross. I mean, there wasn't a case in point. I think these guys didn't, all 11 of them at this point, I don't think they got it. I don't think that they understood that where this was headed and how it was going to get there. But remember, something very interesting is about to take place. When Jesus visits them for the first time after the resurrection, it's interesting in the fact that He begins to talk to them in a way that's different than before. How hard was it for some of them to accept Him actually being out of the grave when all along they were told that same story? Every time something happens in our life that does not agree with our narrative, we begin to figure out ways to fix it when we should be just listening to what God is trying to say. So many. So when I read this piece, especially what we just read, and places me in a place that, that you failed God, and, surely God's not going to use you anymore. When I resigned my post in Bella Vista, California, and left the church there, I remember going to the vice president of our organization, who happened to be up there visiting one of my congregation, and I was invited to the party, and so I came over and I sat down by him, and I said to him, he says, "Do you think I'll ever pastor again? Do you think I will ever do anything?" And you know what? He didn't have an answer for me. I mean, he's a godly man. He's been ministering and doing stuff for, I don't know, at that time, 45, 50 years. And I looked at Brother Taylor, and I just said, "Brother Taylor," I said, "Man," I says, "I don't feel like I'm going to ever make it again. Do you think it's possible?" And he just looked at me and he just said, "Well, sometimes you just got to hang it up." And I said, "Wow, that was probably not what I wanted to hear." And so I thought about that for a little bit, and I was devastated after that time. But what was really interesting was that not more than 4 or 5 months later, after all this went down, I got a phone call from a congregation in Oakview. Believe it or not, I get a phone call through our district superintendent and says, "Hey, they have gone through 22 candidates, and none of the candidates wanted to stay." And I said, "Well, why?" "Well, because there's like 3 people there, and there's a mortgage, and there's this, and there's that, and the other thing." And I said, "Really?" And I says, "And why did they reach out to me?" And he just said, "Because," they said, "they knew that you weren't pastoring right now." So I said, "Well, I'll tell you what. I'll come down, and I'll drag Andrea down with me, and we'll do service and see how that works out." And lo and behold, a former pastor that was here was in the service that morning. Swear to you, sitting right there in the corner. And I thought to myself, I said, "You know what? God is still a God of second chances." We went in '86, planted that church. We're there for 20 plus years. got a church is completely paid for, absolutely, totally out of debt. And we had to go. It's another story about that. And I thought I was done. I thought I had nothing to give. And then all of a sudden I get a phone call from a place called Oakview. At the time it was called New Hope, which we've changed back to the Lighthouse, because that's what this is. This is the difference. Listen carefully. This is the difference in staying in your stuff and waiting on God. When God begins to do something, there is nothing that hell cannot stop what God wants to do. When God wants something, he gets it. Remember last Sunday I talked about it. He chose you. He didn't choose me. We didn't choose him. We didn't choose him. He chose you. He went out of his way. He went to the cross because he chose you. He chose you because he loves you. He chose you because he wanted to bridge the gap that was broken for 400 years, of that silence that was happening between Old and New Testament, all of the things that were going on. Jesus shows up on the scene, and what does he do? He goes to a cross, and he does something that no one has ever done before or since. They kill him, he dies, and he resurrects. And because of that, he has caused us to become more in love with him every day. Because if you become a servant, you will find out what it is to be put in authority. May the Lord just do and show you some things. Remember, he's a God of second chances. Never, ever think that you're done. Because no matter how old you are, no matter how far down the road you think you've gone, no matter how many dumb things you've done, God still has a place on his roster. Isn't it funny? I used the example the other day. I can't remember what. I think it was Charles Barkley, who played for the Phoenix Suns, and he was with a bunch of 9 to 12-year-olds. He's 6'10", right? So he's like twice as tall as everybody there. And so they've got this little guy and this girl picking teams to play basketball. Duh. And so what does he say? The little girl points at Charles and says, "I want him." And so he comes trotting over and says, "I told you I am." They're high-fiving and doing all that. You know why? Because that little girl knew the advantage of having him on her team. Because all they got to do is lob it to him, and he can just dunk it. It's not a big deal. But what I'm saying, in case that you don't get what I'm saying, is that God sees you where you're at, and when he picks those teams, he's going to pick you. No matter how many times you failed, no matter how many times you've done something stupid, he's going to pick you. Peter found that out. Next week we'll take a look at that when we come to see him after the resurrection, and he shows up to talk to his guys. It's time to start rocking and rolling, man. He said, "I'm here, I'm alive, check it out." May the Lord bless you. May his light shine upon you, and wherever you go, bless it. Bless the place you're at. Bless the people that are there. People are being laid off all over the state. My son just called and told me that a mom-and-pop store, a bodega, if you want to call it that, 12 people that worked in that little bodega, they had to lay off 9 of them because it's getting so hard to put food on the table. He says, the boss was talking to my son. He sells gloves and all kinds of stuff like that up north. And he said to him, it was really interesting. He said, "Dad," he said, the owner told me, he said, "I don't even know how much meat to order anymore because no one can afford it." That's sad. That's what's going on right now. But don't fear, because God has never let his people ever go hungry. Never has he ever forsaken us. Let him do what he can do in your midst. May the Lord bless you. Good night from the Lighthouse Living Room. I'm looking forward to hearing what Rabbi has tonight. We'll see you in a few minutes. God bless.